Well, welcome to our final evening at Skidaway lecture for 2023. Thank you for coming. We appreciate your participation in this, our brand new, newly renovated auditorium. Um, we really like this new space, and I believe that it's going to really be great for these kinds of events in the future. We will be distributing a schedule for next year's evening at Skidaway talks after the first of the year. So please be on the lookout for that. As I figure most of you are already members of the Skidaway Associates. If you're not, if you'd like to be, there are envelopes in these little flyers that you see, our latest newsletter. Also, if you just leave us your email address, if you haven't done that already, in the sign-up sheet out in the lobby, we will add you to our mailing list so you'll get announcements for the semester at Skidaway and any other events that we have here on campus coming up in the next year. So tonight, we have a real treat. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Jay Brandis. He's a longtime faculty member here at the Skidaway Institute of Oceanography. Dr. Brandis got a Bachelor of Science and in chemistry and in oceanography from Humboldt State University, now California State Polytechnic at Humboldt, right? So it's now the third Polytechnic University in California. Very exciting. That just happened last year. And Jay and I are both alumni of Humboldt State. Jay went on to get his master's in oceanography and his PhD in chemical oceanography from the University of Washington. So again, very well trained. And tonight he's going to be talking to us about his work in microplastics and also the microplastics in a broader context. So with that, please welcome Dr. Brandis.
Okay. Thank you, Clark. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate you all coming out here on a dark, fortunately not so stormy night, and braving the homicidal deer that are out there. I hope everybody at the end of this is able to get home safely and not have any issues with our local animal population. This really does get a little bit wild out here at night. So those of you who live on the island, I'm sure, are very familiar with that. Okay, it is a real pleasure to talk to you in person. It's a pleasure to talk in front of the YouTube audience, which I appreciate you tuning in on this. It has been, a little while since I gave one of these talks. It certainly has been quite a few years since I gave one of these talks in with a live audience in front of me, and I really enjoy having your faces out there. Whether you agree with me or not, you know, it's like I really appreciate that. So with that said, I'm kind of going to depress you today, I have a feeling, because while in the past I have talked about plastics and said, well, there's a lot of things we don't know about them and so on, but we don't necessarily think that they cause problems. I no longer believe that, and I'll show you why. And it doesn't have to do with my research because I'm just a chemist. I'm not a epidemiologist or a medical doctor or anything like that, but I can read the papers. So first of all, I'd just like to thank my team. Dodie Sanders, who a lot of you know and have worked with here. She retired not too long ago, but remains a dear friend and a confidant. I have started a project with Dr. Sue Ebanks at Savannah State. She is leading a National Science Foundation project looking at microplastics in our region from a variety of different standpoints, from collection to removal strategies. So it's quite broad-ranged, involving a number of scientists from the region, and I will be really having, I think, a great time and a whole student who can devoted to this full-time as part of this project. Abigail McCormick, which if you've been to some of my previous talks, especially the last one, she is a former master's student here at Skidaway who did her thesis on microplastics in the local aquarium across the road from us here. Justin Manley and Tom Bliss, some of you who have worked or gone to some of the oyster hatchery projects. Tom runs the oyster shellfish lab, and Justin basically is head of operations there. And I've been working with them over the past few years trying to look at microplastics in oysters. So that I'm not going to talk about tonight, but I can talk about it afterwards. As well as a whole series of interns, some summer, some longer term, who have done a variety of projects and have really informed, kind of provided background information on what's going on in our local environment from a microplastic standpoint. Okay, so the gloomy part we're going to start to get into, but this is what I'm going to talk about tonight: plastic production patterns, why we're in this mess, why we've gotten to this problem in the first place, and some issues of microplastics from a scientific standpoint, because we still have a very hard time determining just what these things are doing in the environment, how many there are, what they're made out of, where they're coming from, where they're going to. Those all remain big questions around the world. Patterns that we see here that kind of give us some clues as to try and answer some of those questions, and studies that we have done here at Skidaway, as well as I will bring in a few from other places as well. And then the old, Mad Magazine, what, me worry? So in the past, this is the big change. In the past, I've said, well, probably not needing to worry about it right now. We're still working on it. I'm finding I don't really believe that anymore. And I'll talk about that. And I don't want to be too alarmist with you, but I think there are things that you need to know and that you need to tell your friends and neighbors about as you feel comfortable doing. And then what to do, and I have a very simple call to action for this. Okay, things that got us into trouble. This was suggested to me last week, and I think
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
Exactly. How do you mean?
There's a great future in plastics. Think about it. Will you think about it?
Yes, I will.
Enough said. That's a deal.
okay, so young gentlemen like that portrayed by Dustin Hoffman and young women of that generation took that to heart. And so did their children. And they made plastics into the next big thing, didn't they? This is a graph of plastic production. It really started in earnest 1950 or so. And by the mid-1990s, we already were producing as much plastics per year as the net weight of all land animals on Earth. Okay? 2011 or so, we have surpassed the use of hydrocarbons in making plastics over that of use in aircraft travel. And so this is all recorded. This is all set. It's already happened. We go to 2050 with current predictions, and these are based on industry predictions and an extrapolation of the patterns that we have seen. We will be using more plastic or more hydrocarbons for plastics than are currently consumed, hydrocarbons that are consumed by the coal industry. So that's a little bit esoteric, but it gives you an idea. But look at that curve. This is what we would call, in my field, an exponentially increasing curve, which is a very dangerous thing because it's not just going up linearly. It's not just a nice even thing. It's accelerating in production of plastic. So those fine gentlemen that got into the plastic business have done a bang-up job of coming up with new uses of plastics. And I want to point out first disturbing statistic. This period from 2000 to now, we have produced 60% of all plastics that have ever been produced on Earth. Just this century. It's all happened in this period of time when you and I have been in our productive lives and so on. The world has changed and we haven't even noticed it. We really don't. I mean, nobody really pays attention to this. All of a sudden, everything comes in plastic. Everything has a container. Everybody's using plastic bottles for water and stuff like that. And when you and I were growing up, we didn't do those things. We were growing up, you know, when plastics were fairly rare and they were used for certain things like electrical equipment and stuff like that, which are really kind of long-term uses. So we've been kind of snuck up upon by this monster of production. And the worst part about it is, of that production, 60% of that is short-term throwaway crap. It's food containers, wrapping, shipping, clothing. It's all short-term. It's this red stuff here that is accelerated like crazy. So it's gone up. 60% of plastics have been produced in the last 23 years, and 60% of that is short-term, throwaway, disposable, gets into the environment and causes problems. And if I have any message to you today, my message is this cannot continue. Okay. So it is common nowadays for people and the climate scientists to say, okay, well, what happens if we were to all of a sudden get our act together and do different things? And so in this case, this is a study saying, okay, well, around 2020, what happens if we just stop making plastics? And this is an estimate of the plastics of larger size in the oceans. So we're looking at chunks. We're looking at the stuff that you see in the stories, you know, when you see a boat driving through a bunch of stuff in the ocean. That's this stuff. And these bigger pieces of plastics, if we stopped, and it's completely, you know, it's a complete fantasy. We're not going to do that. But if we had stopped in 2020, you would see a slow decline as nature got rid of this material. We could probably boost that along if we wanted to, but that's the way it is. If we stopped increasing that, it would continue to increase up to 2.5 times what we see right now, but it would not stop, obviously. We would be continuing to increase the amounts in the environment, even though we were producing the exact same amount we do today. And if we just sit on our butts and do nothing and just let those plastic producers sell more and more wonderful products to us, this is what we got. Okay? Now keep in mind, that's for the big stuff. We're not talking about microplastics yet. So I'm going to talk about microplastics. It's an area of research that I've been involved in again for about almost 20 years now. But I didn't know I was involved in it at first, and I'll explain why. So the idea is microplastics are smaller than 5 millimeters in size. So you can look at them. If you look at them under the biggest ones, you can kind of see. But most of them are much smaller than that. They are smaller than that, but they can get a lot smaller. And what the science community has done is said, okay, because it's microplastics, that means that we'll go down to the size of 1 micrometer, 1/1,000,000th of a meter. That's the lower size range that we have agreed upon covers microplastics. But we know, an occasional study that has been really difficult to do, that they don't stop at 1 micron. They keep going because they break down into smaller pieces. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle or Lego thing, and you get smaller and smaller blocks until you eventually get to things that are just a few building blocks of plastic in them. And this is just an illustration of how this goes. You start off with a plastic bottle, and all of us has probably been aware of plastics that get left out in sunlight or out in the environment, and they get brittle, and they start getting easy to break, and they start shattering, and they produce smaller and smaller pieces that are harder and harder to clean up. It's easy to clean up a plastic bottle. It is a royal pain in the butt to try to clean up something that's broken into tiny shards. And yet, that process keeps going. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So how did I get into this? Well, I'm a chemical oceanographer. I studied nutrients when I did my PhD. I studied nitrogen and carbon and stuff like that. And that was the main reason I was hired here back in 2005. But I have this mind that's never quite content with just doing the same thing over and over again. And I worked with some fabulous scientists up at Carnegie Institution of Washington, one of whom had access to this amazing microscope. It uses X-rays instead of light. You know, when we look through a microscope, it uses light. X-rays have a much smaller wavelength, so you can look at much smaller things. These things are capable of looking inside a bacteria innards and telling you what's in them. So it's like an X-ray for a bacteria or even a virus. And I was looking at some samples from an area between England and Europe in 2003, 2004 on one of these instruments. And I kept coming across these weird, I knew they had carbon in them because that's the way the microscope was set up, and I was looking at carbon, but it was telling me it wasn't the kind of carbon I'm used to seeing. It didn't look like bacteria. It didn't look like plants or animals or whatever. It had this weird stuff going on it. And so I talked to the scientists there at the instrument, and they said, well, take a look at our database of spectra. We have this. And it turns out these microscopes are also used by people that design plastics because they like to look at the structure and how the structure of plastics and all the different sort of subunits are put together and how they crystallize and all that sort of stuff. And these microscopes are very helpful for that because they can look at the intimate details of the chemistry of plastics. This was a plastic. That little yellow, I know it's impossible to see online stuff, but right in the center of that circle, there is a little blob of something that was identified by the X-ray microscope as plastic. And I thought, what the heck is this doing in the ocean? And remember, early 2000s, we hadn't really started. So I started to look at the literature, and we were just starting to understand things about garbage patches and the big stuff like I talked about before. And that's what fascinated me. It's organic matter. It was just all those colors represent different types of organic matter. So it might be like some fats or some carbohydrates or something like that. It's a chemical map of what's in there. The blue is the background. So this is all background. This is the particle, and each one of these colors represents a different type of carbon that the software has identified in that sample. So, and you can see just for scale purposes how that looks compared to a human hair. Okay, so this got me really interested in this thing. And I started studying it. And let's get back to that 22,000 figure, which is really startling if you think about it. 22,000 pieces of plastic in the ocean, from the smallest to the largest, for every one of you. How did we get there? Well, when I started with this, we were thinking that the number was maybe a few hundred per person or so. And it just kept going up and up as we got more and more studies. The problem is plastics, microplastics, because they go down to really small sizes, become really, really hard to measure when they're really, really small. And so the people that started off in these studies, and this includes me and Doty, we started off looking at the bigger things. And big is a relative term. We were looking at things like 1/3 of a millimeter in size or 1/10 of a millimeter in size. But we have found that if you go down to this micron size range or the submicron size range, that the numbers go way up. And these estimates don't even include some of that data. But the more that has been sampled and the more they try to correct for the fact that we're not looking at the smallest ones, the bigger that number becomes. Okay. Microplastics. This is the same curve by that same study looking at a prediction of the future of what we do. But microplastics behave differently because they're coming apart from, they have a source from the plastic that's already out there in the environment. So if we shut things off at 2000, they just keep going. And if we keep a steady flow here, it goes up faster. And if we do nothing, it goes up even more, but maybe not as much as you might expect. But the point is that nothing we do right now is going to stop this in the environment. So, okay, well, what does that really mean and where are these things coming from? Problem from a scientific perspective. So as a scientist, I'd really like a method to measure microplastics where I could just like take a parcel of water and stick it in an instrument and it would tell me. I'm sure all the volunteers that spend all those hours trying to count microplastics would have loved to have had something where you just put a shrimp in and it measures what's in there. And we can do that for things like lead or mercury or calories or whatever. But for microplastics, we don't have that. And people have been working on this for as long as I've been looking in the field, and we don't have any perfect methods yet. We have slow methods that work, but they're really time consuming and really labor intensive. Sure. It's on from my own because I had to prepare that sample in a special way in order for the microscope to look at it. And if it were contamination from anything else in there, it would not have, the microscope would have just seen it as a giant blob, basically. I didn't mention the microplastic type, but it was basically polymethyl acrylate, if I remember correctly. Well, I don't know what it was. It was encased in some, what we would just call organic matter. That was a particle that had been captured on a filter from water in the North Sea. So you take your water, pour it through a filter, and then it's captured on the filter. And then we take that and analyze it. Mm-hmm. No, and I will also just say it wasn't bacteria. It was a piece of plastic. So it was non-living. And the stuff around it might have come from a bacteria at one time, but it was dead as well. And we couldn't do that with this machine. Just kind of tells you what material it's made out of. It doesn't tell you where it came from. So problems with this. They're not easily measured. They're easily contaminated. This whole room is contaminated with microplastics. My lab is contaminated with microplastics. We have to take very special precautions, as our volunteers saw, in order to keep things from being contaminated. You need to separate them from their environment and concentrate for analysis a lot of times. It's like you're looking at a needle in a haystack, because even if you're looking at 100 microplastics in a parcel of water, you've seen our water here. It's mucky, and you're not going to just be able to pick them out by your eye. Talk about this in a moment. We need complex, expensive instrumentation to establish their exact composition. We do not have little triangles with numbers on them telling you what plastics there are. You have to actually have an instrument that does it. And again, this big issue, the smaller they are, the more difficult it gets to measure them. And the smaller they are, I'm going to explain, the more we have to worry about them. So, methods to measure microplastics. So this is what some of you have done. We started off visually looking at them under a microscope, things that looked artificial, things that had a particular color or a shape or whatever that looked plasticky. It's not a great, it's very subjective, and there are lots of things that could mimic it or we would miss. We've gone to a combination of visual plus filters. You use a special light like a black light to illuminate your samples, and some plastics will glow under that, and you use a certain filter to take out the blue light to be able to see this. This is something that Dr. Eubanks is using at Savannah State and has had a pretty good amount of success with that, with the bigger stuff. What we do here is a chemical microscope using infrared or Raman spectroscopy. So we use Raman spectroscopy. And then what I just showed you is if you really want to see the small stuff, you have to use something like an electron microscope or an X-ray microscope, which are really big, expensive, hard to get time on, rare. So these are sorts of things that some of you may have even analyzed at some point or another. But this is what you might see under the microscope as visually identifiable microplastics. But even in that case, like here or here, there's a bunch of little threads, and they have color to them, but we can't really be sure if those are plastics, even though they kind of look plasticky. So we needed to move on to something a little bit better. And so that's what we did. We got the National Science Foundation to buy us a confocal Raman microscope. So it's a microscope, that's what the middle here is, and it has a laser. So it's cool. It basically blasts your sample with a laser. And the reason why it does this is it uses something called the Raman effect. Raman effect discovery of it was a Nobel Prize winning discovery by Raman in India. And he found that everything that you shine light on, most of it bounces off or absorbed, whatever. That's why we have colors in our shirts and stuff like that. But a tiny bit, like way less than 1%, interacts with the molecules of whatever that light hits, and it's altered. So imagine something coming in as blue light. It comes in, some of that energy is transferred and bounces around inside the molecules, and then it goes and comes re-emitted. And so that re-emitted light reflects what that material is made out of. So we get a fingerprint, a chemical fingerprint, and because it's a microscope, we can look at these little bitty pieces of plastic or whatnot and get an idea of what they are. And when we did this, we found this was something that we were surprised about, and certainly a lot of other scientists in the area were surprised about. I was working on a study with a group at NOAA Charleston looking at things that they had thought were microplastics in fish guts. And they'd sent me a whole bunch of these little tiny white fibers, and they had tested them in different ways, and they were sure they were microplastics. A quarter of them at least were cotton, cellulose. They look similar. That's polyester, that's cotton, but under the Raman microscope have very different spectra, and they are very characteristic of very different pieces. And it's only that way that we were able to tell what's what. And they have their own theories. We have a paper out on this about why this is, and maybe some suggestions. Yes? Yeah, and I'll get to that, because most of what we're finding in our environment are fibers and strings and threads. Yeah. Well, I'll give you a little bit of a, yeah.
So if I could ask, if we can hold our questions again, the online audience without even stopping them.
Okay. Okay, last question was about why are there fibers and how does a bottle become little bits of fibery material? And I'll talk about that in a minute. But let's first I'm just going to lead you through a journey here. So this was Abigail McCormick's master's thesis that she did 2020, right when COVID hit, to 2022. She really wanted to work in the aquarium. Aquarium was shut down, but they were very nice to allow her to go in and sample a set of the tanks as well as the touch tank and the what they have is the source water for all the tanks. They bring it in, they filter it, and then they pass it around to the other tanks and stuff. And, you know, in 2020, 2021, they were mostly shut down. They didn't allow the public in there. And so she was able to sample it at that time. Okay, we got a notification. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So we have this situation. It's a perfect experimental situation. It's shut down, no people in there. We're going to measure microplastics in tanks that are exposed to the environment at different levels, like the tank is open in the touch tank. You can go over and stick your arm in it, all the way to the source water. And so she took samples every 2 weeks and then ran them on that Raman, and she ran something like 10,000 different particles and what she would call masses, so anything that wasn't a string. And she ran those for chemical composition and size and a bunch of other stuff. And we went into this with the thought that microplastics, well, of course, when we open it up, we get a burst of microplastics from all those. We're like Pigpen out of peanuts, you know? We just got plastics all over. We're opening the doors and letting it in from outside and all that sort of stuff. So we were expecting a big spike of microplastics, and then we thought, well, maybe we can start looking at where it's coming from and all that kind of stuff. And this is the scientific process in action, because our hypothesis was disproven. This is a graph of the attendance in there, the number of people in the building, and then it was opened up in June of 21. You can see a big spike. You know, people wanted to get out and do things, so they went to the aquarium and they went in there and they did stuff. This complicated looking thing here is the number of particles. So this is everything she captured on a filter, including things that aren't plastic. But you can see there really isn't a huge difference, and for sure there isn't an increase after June 21st. This one, because of the Raman, we can say how many of those were actually plastic. So these are plastics per liter, and these are the different tanks. Red is reservoir, light blue is touch tank, and the other two were regular fish tanks. And you can see even clearly here, it did not go up. It went down when we opened up the aquarium to people. Now, one thing that did happen was the aquarium took advantage of this closed period, and they said, okay, there's nobody here, let's fix the carpets. They're old, you need to wear them out. So there was carpet renovation, and we do see a pulse of plastics during those carpet renovations, but not when we had people there. And moreover, these are scientific plots. It's kind of Christmassy. There's a red and a green. The box represents the most of the, like 95% of the particle size or particle numbers. And these are just averaged between when it was closed and when it was open. And the stars represent where there's a significant, statistically significant change between those two. So this is all the particles. There was a significantly different change between the two, but again, went down. Microplastics, a bigger change, or at least visually looking like a bigger change, and a statistically different one. Among the plastics, it seemed like the most change was in polypropylene here. We also saw a decrease in polyethylene. The only one that went up when it opened, who knows why, we still don't know why, is Teflon or Teflon-like materials. Now, we chose these different categories partially because we saw them, but also because these are materials that make up components of these tanks, filters, pipes, so on in the tanks. What we did not see was nylon. We did not see a big increase in nylon, even though that's what the rug is made out of. So again, there's a big increase in particles in there, or at least an increase in particles, and it is significant when they redid the carpet in there, but it appears to be dust and crap coming off of those carpet. It's not the carpet itself. The carpets themselves were pretty benign. They didn't really do anything. The real take-home message we got out of this was that we don't see huge differences between these two, and we did not see big differences between the source waters and the touch tank. They all kind of move together. This suggested to us that a large amount of these microplastics in the aquarium are not coming internally at all. They're not coming from people. They're not coming from the rug. They seem to be coming from the source water, from the water in the Skidaway River right out there. And a lot of them were dominated by these fibers. They were not dominated by chunks and stuff like that. Okay, so piece number one. Our estuary has a lot of microfibers in it of plastic origin, and it seems that the aquarium itself is not doing a good job filtering out this stuff, at least not a complete job of filtering these things out. And none of the little filters that they have inside the aquarium is doing a good job either, because it really isn't changing as the water passes through different systems. We did not see, we can't blame the visitors at all. We expected bigger changes than we actually saw. But we basically that water offshore. I wonder. So that made us look at some of our old data a little bit more. So this is data that you've seen before if you've been to any of my talks. This is a study of microplastics along our coast here. And the main points that we found were that there were higher concentrations associated with people. Now, we thought originally, okay, well, that's because there's tons of people and you've got airborne plastics and you got all sorts of activity and stuff like that. But that aquarium study kind of made me rethink things. This is Savannah, and you see, first of all, there's big concentrations in places, but there's also a lot of variability. And one thing we know about our local estuaries, they're really good particle traps. They will trap stuff in our local estuaries. They're a natural filter. But we're dumping them in, and they're not coming from the Savannah River. They're not coming from Augusta. They're not coming from Atlanta or something like that. They're coming, here's our sewage treatment plant. We've got a bigger number south of the sewage treatment plant. And we also saw numbers that were higher at the sewage treatment plant's outflows in Brunswick and St. Mary's. So again, this is telling us something. No, this is the previous, sorry. I just had a close-up of that area, but here's Brunswick and here's St. Mary's. And if I had, I have in the past had little blow-ups where it shows where the treatment plants are and some of those dots are. So we also had another intern go out and collect waters in the dock every day, low tide, high tide for the summer. They had a good time. And they found that, yeah, it's not just spatially they're all over the place. They're temporally, there's spikes, there's stuff coming in that changes it by an order of magnitude. And in all of this, there's a consistent pattern that we're seeing threads and fibers as 80% of what we're seeing in the waters. Why is that? Where could those be coming from? Well, a lot of other people have been looking at this sort of question too. And the conclusion of the community is it's coming from washing our clothes. It's coming from washing our textiles. Because we always think about lint, right? We can see the lint, we have to clean our lint traps, but we don't think about our washers. And our washers are taking those same clothes and they're beating them up and they're using detergents and all that sort of stuff. And that releases little chunks of our clothes into the water stream where we do not have any filters whatsoever, goes into the waste stream, goes down to the wastewater treatment plant, and most wastewater treatment plants have no ability to deal with these tiny pieces of stuff. It also makes sense why we see so much cotton in there, because people's jeans and cotton clothes and stuff like that show up in there too. But that's where we think the majority of our microplastics that we look at, and again, I'm looking at bigger stuff, so I'm not, and bigger stuff is a relative term. We cut off at about 60 microns just because it's really hard for us to look at smaller stuff with our instrumentation and with all the other stuff that is in our waters. So all of this, the aquarium study, this work, all suggests that it's coming from our clothing and it's a local source. So that suggests us a little bit of a possibility that we can control this in a way. I know, because I've talked to audiences about this, most of us really don't think about what our clothes are made out of when we're picking them out. We look at their, how they fit on us and their color and their style and all that kind of stuff. And maybe for a real special occasion, we might be looking at something like silk or cashmere or something like that. But, by and large, we're not. And especially for most people, especially if you're on a budget, you might just be tempted to grab whatever's the cheapest thing that doesn't look terrible and buy that. And by and large, those things are made out of plastic, largely. Polyethylene, polypropylene, and so on. And what I suggest is that we need to change our buying habits. We have the power to change what those guys in the graduate were talking about, because the plastics industry is not going to keep making more and more material if nobody is there to buy it. That's a message I'm going to keep coming back to. That's the decision, and that's the call to action that I have for every one of you is, I know you're not going to stop all plastics use. I don't expect that. I think that sort of thinking is absurd and it's counterproductive. But there are alternatives in clothing, in towels, and other things that are made out of natural materials. And quite frankly, that was the way it was when we have an older audience in here, we were when we were growing up. We weren't buying a bunch of polyethylene stuff. Now, then we got in the 70s and stuff, we had some weird and wild fashions there. But we have allowed this to continue because it's easy, it's cheap. I will say that plasticky type garments and stuff have properties like no wrinkle, easy to wash, stain-free, that kind of stuff. But it's worth thinking about. And this is why. We have really thoroughly fouled our globe with plastics. They've been found everywhere, every corner of the globe, every beach in the world, all oceans, surface and deep and in between. We have found microplastics and plastics debris. Beaches on every island, including the most remote ones you can imagine, that have no people on them whatsoever in the Southern Ocean. All they have is seals. And there's tons of plastic that wash up on the shores there that come from other parts of the world. The Japanese have done expeditions to the Marianas Trench, 35,000 feet under the oceans, well away from Asia, chunks of plastic down there. We have had people that have taken samples from Mount Everest, plastics up there. From the European Alps, they've run little samplers up there to see the plastic cloud coming off of Europe. And most importantly, in this room and in your home, because they're everywhere and you don't know it. You don't know it. We had this was really startling when we were doing this work, that we had to really worry about contamination in my lab, where I don't necessarily do a lot of plastic stuff, but no matter what, you had to use very special things. You had to filter your air first before you actually processed your samples, because otherwise you would get little tiny fibers and little tiny chunks of plastic. And this is really where it gets scary, okay? Plastics have been found in our lungs, in our digestive systems, in our blood, in our brains, and in human placentas. And if you think about the human placenta, that's about as protected an area in your body that you're going to find. And how does the plastic get in there? Well, remember back to those really bitty ones, those really tiny ones. They actually pass through cell walls. They can pass through your gut wall, get into your blood, and from there, go all through your body into all sorts of different places. So you've got plastic running through you, and you don't know it. You don't know it at all. It's estimated, other people have made this measurement, or made this estimation, that each one of us consumes about a credit card worth of plastics every week. And I'll bet you don't remember that last week, do you? Your credit card meal, your plastic meal. Because none of us do. It's so pervasive, and it's so small, and it's so innocuous, it doesn't even make us sneeze. So that's why you tend to think of it as just sort of harmless. Why should we care? Why should we worry about it? Okay, well, it's in our bodies or whatever. We did a study, Dodie and I, and this was part of the volunteer group too, where we were looking at microplastics in the guts of different small sea creatures. They're like shrimp. We found that roughly 20% of them had microplastics in their guts from our little environment here. But remember, we were looking at what I think of as the larger size fraction. There was a study, and by the way, this is the study looking at human placenta. These are microplastics that they found, and they identified it by Raman in there in a human placenta. There was a study a few years ago because a bunch of baby sea turtles washed up on the shore south of us, I think down by Jekyll, and they found that a lot of them had digestive systems that were clogged by chunks of plastic, and this is the way we normally think of plastics being bad. They clog the digestive systems of birds, turtles, fish, whales, sharks, whatever. Or you have nets and things like that that entangle organisms, or you have beer can rings that get around their necks, and as they grow, that cuts off their body, and you get these horrible pictures and stuff. And those are sort of the macro scales. But this group really did a bang-up job. They did a whole study of looking at plastics, and they found that in the digestive systems of these turtles, they were producing nanoplastics from microplastics as they digested. They weren't completely digesting things, but they were breaking them into pieces. And there have been further studies showing that other sea organisms do this. There's no reason to suspect that, our bodies don't do exactly the same thing, but it's harder to study humans than it is to study something like that. But we have assumed that plastics, because we use them so much and because they don't cause immediate harm, are safe. And I'm here to tell you that I no longer think that to be the case. This is a study that came out this August. A group, and it's basically, I keep getting asked about this stuff, and I keep saying, well, the epidemiologists, the people that study disease, this is a new field for them. It's taken them a while to start spinning up studies. But they fed mice, which are our standard mammal model for disease. They fed them specific nanoplastics that were very fluorescent in a particular color. So they could know exactly where they were. And they did a control study, no microplastics or nanoplastics, and with microplastics. And they grew them up, and they checked their behavior. And they found that the microplastics had made it into their brains. They had passed the blood-brain barrier, which is really effective at keeping most things out, including most bacteria. But there's a piece right there. And if one wants to look at this study, they also found behavioral changes in both the young and the old. They found brain changes in the young and the old mice. So we are swimming stuff. There's no doubt that this has the capability of getting into our brains, our children's brains. We don't know yet the mechanisms. They have their own particular theories on here, and obviously there's a lot more research that needs to be done. But this is a very insidious problem. And the immediate solution is not clear. Because as I said, you can shut off a lot of plastic production, and you still have the plastics in our environment breaking down into things. So to sum up, this is the problem. We are increasing our production of plastic materials exponentially. 60% of all plastics ever produced were produced in this century. 60% of all plastics are used in the food industry and food-related and clothing-related products. We have covered the globe in this material. We ingest and breathe this pollutant daily without noticing any immediate consequence. And the hardest ones to measure have immediate health effect, or have measurable health effects, at least in that study. And there are studies on other organisms as well, but the nanoplastics is just finally getting some papers coming out on it. So, when you're stuck in a situation that you have dug yourself into, there's an expression, and I tried to find the originator of this expression. I could not find it. It's been attributed to many different people. I'm going to pick a British politician of the 80s who said it quite well. Stop digging a hole. Stop it. With so many problems in this world, we need to make the choices to stop making things worse. Stop digging. We cannot, I feel, continue on this trajectory. And we will, unless we make the choices. Because I guarantee you talk to other people, they'll be like, oh, you know, I don't think plastics are any problem whatsoever. I mean, I don't care if I eat some or whatever. They need to understand that these things are not innocuous. And it drives me nuts because you have a lot of conspiracy theories out there. And I hate to be a person that might be included in that because I feel like this is hard science that I'm talking about here. But you have lots of conspiracy theories out there that are based on a lot less, that people are just fully embracing. And yet, here we have what I think of as almost an existential crisis on Earth. We need to take this seriously. And so we need, each and every one of us, to make decisions that reduce the amount of plastics in our lives, reduce the amount of usage of plastics. When we go to the store, be mindful of what you buy. That buy stuff that isn't as plastic. What you do buy and what you have to use, because I recognize that there's no way on Earth that we're going to just stop using plastics. It is really, really hard. It's like asking everybody to go live in a cave without power. It's not something I think is realistic to ask of most people. You know, it has to be your own personal decision. But realize, we grew up without plastics. We did. We grew up without vast amounts of plastics in our lives. We didn't buy plastic bottles. We didn't have all these foods with lots of plastic all over them and stuff. I remember when TV dinners were in aluminum containers. You know, I'm that old. But they're pervasive. And I recognize it's not going to be easy. And obviously, there are certain things like, well, spandex is a plastic. Well, I'm not asking everybody to give up their nice stretchy clothes for things like that, but buy less of it. Use it more carefully. We have to start with things that are easy. Cloth bags instead of plastic bags. I've harped about this for years. It's just so much nicer to go into Publix or Kroger with your own bags and fill them up and reuse them over and over again. I would implore all of you to stop drinking water and drinks from plastic bottles. Those are known microplastic sources. They have been measured in both bottles and cans. If you can, and this is what you have to look at and do your own research, find really good filters before drinking anything. Pass it through a filter to try to capture as much as you can before it gets into your body. Depends on the refrigerator. I would have to look at the specs. You know, I don't know. Wait, just hold on. I will be more than happy to talk. I want to make sure that our audience out there can hear us. I'm almost done, okay? I promise you, I'm almost done. Make sure plastics are disposed of properly when they're used as unavoidable. That just means we don't let them sit out there in the environment, bake under the sun, break into little pieces, and get out there. And we must do these choices ourselves. Our government's not going to make those choices for us. And Industry sure as heck isn't. They will make the choices when we stop providing them incentives to do it. They're making more and more plastics because it makes them money to sell this stuff. They have a great business operation and they are building new plastics making plants as fast as they can because there's all these new products and all this stuff and all these different markets to be able to sell it to. And we are killing ourselves. I feel like that this is just something that we have to be passionate about. And this is the last sort of thing that I'll leave you with, because this is also one that I get, especially from students and things like that. What difference can I make? What difference can I make? Well, we can't make, like what I do. You think I'll make a difference in the world consumption of plastic? No. It's a rounding error someplace way, 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 way down. But more and more people do this. More and more people, and I'm not the only one putting this message out there. That's what this cartoon is. We're too small to make a difference. We're too small to make a difference. We're really too small. Well, imagine if every single one of those people made a difference, if they did something. Then you do make a difference. When you start affecting the bottom line, that's when you see change. And there are alternatives. I don't have time to talk about them in terms of plastics. There are biodegradable plastics. As we get to understand things better, we may find plastics that are less problematic to our brains and our bodies. We don't know at this point. It's still in our infancy, but that's the problem. We are just digging ourselves a hole as fast as possible without looking around and seeing what's going on. So with that, I'm going to leave you and I'll take some questions. I appreciate everybody coming tonight. I hope I've given you some things to think about. And you had a question first. So Clark, do you have the microphone? Oh, okay. I was just, because I know.
I'm not sure we can do both at the same time.
Well, I'll turn mine off. Hold on. I just want to bring my microphone so people could hear you. If you don't want to talk on Zoom, that's okay. I just wanted to make sure everybody could hear. They should be able to hear you.
I'm not used to a microphone. The average filter on the refrigerator takes out chlorine. There's carbon in there, or charcoal, and it might take out some mild bacteria. And if you need anything more than that, usually if you check with your water company, they usually have their water tested, and you can find out if anything else is needed. In some areas, there are occasionally a pollutant that temporarily, hopefully, needs to be removed. And in this country, we don't need viruses usually removed. So usually your average filter on a fridge is taking your chlorine out, most importantly, so it tastes better. And the other thing I wanted to mention was, you mentioned that there were cotton fibers. So those, are you sure they were from clothing, or were they from the cotton industry, like cotton plants?
I think they're from clothing. I can't be certain. And that is because, again, they don't have labels. I can say they're cotton or cellulose. Sometimes we'd see something like tencel, which is bamboo. Sometimes we'd say rayon, but a lot of times we just see cotton. And sometimes it looked like a thread. It really did have like that rope type structure. And sometimes it would be colored. We find a number of these little fibers that are really hard to analyze. They're blue, and it causes all sorts of fits with the Raman. But when we have been able to identify it, we've actually identified the dye as indigo. So we think they're blue jeans. But, again, we don't know exactly where it is. All I know is that chemically it is cotton. So and again, this is an assumption. I don't know, maybe cotton has problems too, but that's down the line. I'm much more worried about artificial substances than I'm worried about something that has been on Earth for millions, however many millions of years. You have other questions? Okay. Feel like Phil Donahue or something.
I'm a bit of a skeptic here.
Okay.
That's fine. You said that in the rat thing, where they that they fed them na- nanoplastics, and they found one.
No, there are more than that.
Oh, well, you
I
showed
showed you
me
one
one.
just because
Okay.
it's clear.
Well, the question I had was for for a human, what's the problem? I mean, if
So, I'm not saying that rats are perfect or mice. On humans? No, because how are you going to take a mother and tell her, okay, you've got twins. I'm going to feed this one nanoplastics and this one not. How many mothers do you think are going to agree to that study? That's the problem. You can do this with mice. Mice never have any consent because they come from breakdown of bigger things. That's what I was talking about. Yes, you are. You have eaten a credit card's worth of microplastics in the last week. At least that's what the study suggests. And maybe more if you eat a lot of seafood. They come from your salt, they come from your drinks, they come from your meat, they come from all sorts of sources. You have to stop using plastics in the food stream, first of all, and reduce the amount of food plastic use. I found it really fascinating that even Boris Johnson, who I politically thought was a really crazy character in England, former prime minister, he came out and said, we have to reduce the use of plastics. We have to reduce the production of plastics. There was a study that came out this year. You know, I'm sure that most of you have seen the studies. Like there's this very well-intentioned European guy who builds these devices to clean up plastic patches in the ocean. Well, they actually went and kind of tested what was going on, and it produces more fragments of plastic than it picks up. Because as it's straining it out of the water, these are little weak, broken down pieces of plastic, and they fall apart. So it's things like that that you got to watch out for. Yes. Oh, sorry.
In what I've been noticing is in publications and online, and urging people to stop with this fast fashion, which the kids love. They go and buy cheap things over and over and over. But for young professionals on up to retired people, the push is buy fewer clothes, buy higher quality, buy clothes that will last for decades. I have clothes that I've had for 40 years. If you buy the quality of usually natural fabrics, you can wear those clothes for years. So there is in the publishing world, in the fashion industry, there is a push for eliminating this fast fashion. And the what happens to these clothes, you think when you donate your used clothes to Goodwill or the Humane Society, wherever, most of those clothes, probably 90% of those clothes do not get sold. They get bundled up and sent to developing countries to be reprocessed into other textiles, other fabrics. And there's a loss, of course, of a great deal of that in that process. So, buy a $100 cashmere sweater, don't buy the $10 plastic sweater, and wear it for the rest of your life. That's the message that's being put out there in the fashion world.
Well, this is a request for help, I guess. It's so clear to those of us who aren't skeptics that
Do genuine research.
well, as someone who takes what you've said seriously and wants to do something about it, it seems like the problem is too large. You say you've got to start somewhere, but I think it would be really helpful if there was a graph of priorities, like, should we stop this thing about not using plastic straws drives me crazy because it seems to me there've got to be way more important things we could do. But
Anyway, sorry. So I mean, the low hanging fruit is this stuff that's been produced in the last 23 years. I don't feel like it's that bad an idea to kind of go back to the things that we were doing in the 1980s. No, I just think that is not too big an ask of people. But whatever you can do, but you have to be more mindful. I think that's really the message for this whole century is you just have to be mindful, because if you're not, you will be led in directions that you may not like, and you won't even know it. Did you have something, Clark?
What about recycling? How effective is that?
Okay, that's a bugaboo of mine, and that's a bugaboo. That's a thing that I get frustrated with, because recycling sucks, and people don't want to hear it. It does well for things like aluminum and cardboard where there's a market for it, but we live in a capitalist society, and we should recognize that. So people aren't going to do something with your plastic unless there's some money in it, and there's no money in it. There's no money in glass. You talk to any of the agencies, they don't take recycled glass anymore because there's no money. People won't pay them to take it away. And plastic is the same way. So it tends to get put in the landfill. And that's unfortunate, because it is not easy to recycle plastic. It really isn't. You have to clean it, you have to sort it by its type, which typically it requires either really expensive machines that have like those Raman lasers and stuff like that to say, okay, this is polyethylene or this is polyethylene, or you have some poor third world person, which is what they were doing for a while, sitting there in a garbage heap going, whatever. And even there, a lot of times, if you have enough sorted pile, it's like nobody wants to buy it, so they burn it or they bury it.
We have those pink things that I try to recycle, and I just found out that it's going to cost like $20 a quarter now to do that, or a month, $20 a month. Do I need to do that? Is that crazy?
Well, I'll tell you what, I don't know what the Landings is doing. I would be darn sure to talk to the people that are doing this and find out what they're doing with the material. Have them show you what they're doing with the material. Say, okay, yes, we have a place that is specially set up to sort and recycle this stuff. Because my impression is that in Chatham County and most of the United States, there just is no effective recycling. They just put it in the landfill.
Um, this is related to what you were just saying, but I we supposedly have curbside recycling where I live in Garden City, and also in other parts of Chatham County where you have the recycling dumpster and the landfill dumpster. I do a lot of dumpster diving, and I'm very careful about sorting my stuff, but almost nobody else does. And I can't believe the stuff that's being put in the recycling dumpsters is getting recycled. And I have asked the people that when they come around and collect it, I say, this is so mixed up. Do y'all actually recycle this stuff? And I can't get a straight answer, but they'll say something like, some of the loads we pick up, which are supposedly recyclables, is so contaminated, they just haul the whole load to the landfill. I have contacted Waste Management, which supposedly handles it, and they won't give me a straight answer as to what proportion actually gets recycled. But the way I see, I mean, the vast majority of recycling dumpsters, when I look at them, it's just totally indiscriminate. And my point is, I think very little of what we put in the recycling dumpsters is actually getting recycled. And it'd be nice if you or somebody could research that and try to get a straight answer from the county commissioners, city council, waste management, or whoever. They won't give me a straight answer.
Probably won't give me one either, I'll tell you. Anyway, Clark is standing up, so we're probably,
No, not at all. I just wanted to comment that if they find anything in your recycling can that is not recyclable, they throw the whole can out. They don't spend the time to separate it. That's not what they do. The other thing is that at least I don't know about you and your reading, but I've heard statistics like only 10% of all the plastics that's ever been created have been recycled. And that we need to use plastics because they're recyclable is a big lie, and it's sort of like the oil industry hiding the information about climate change that they already knew about. This is the plastics industry has not been letting people know. They've been paying for these public media campaigns about recycle your plastics. We can do it all, but it just isn't being done and can't be done effectively. That's what I've heard.
there's lots of other stuff. I mean, like there was a study that came out recently where they went to a place that was taking plastic and they were making it into, I think it was either shoes or clothing, and then they were selling it as recycle. And they were producing vast amounts of microplastics in the process. So it's aggravating.
I don't know about Garden City, but in the city of Savannah, it was recently revealed that when we thought that the glass that we threw in with recycle was being separated out, but it was not. So they now have a separate glass recycling program, but you have to carry your glass to a drop site. Well, in my case, it's very convenient. I mean, it's the container is up by a firehouse, so it's always open. So can always get into the property. There's another place on Skidaway Road they lock the gates at 5 o'clock, but I found out from my neighbors that there was this place just a few blocks away. So I generate a whole lot of wine bottles. So it's being recycled by some glass recycling company. This is a contract that the city, I live in the city, so I don't know if it's a city or county. The very first recycling contract that was drawn up by the city about 10 or 12 years ago, maybe longer than that, was touted as being single stream. You could throw everything in. They found out not too long ago that the glass was just not being separated at all. So they got a separate glass recycling contract, and we don't pay more. We do pay for recycling, but we don't pay more to dump that glass in an approved location. And from a medical standpoint, I'm not a doctor, I'm a PA, but I follow every aspect of medicine. There's an increase in dementia of all sorts, and there's an increase, and we're really unsure about this, in prion disease, which is like Creutzfeldt-Jakob. It's a brain disease, and there's an increase in that. Something is crossing the blood-brain barrier.
And the point is, we don't know. And previous lectures, I've always said, well, we just don't know. We probably don't have a problem here. But that study and the placenta study really kind of changed my mind on this sort of stuff. So we'll see. You know, it's kind of like when they talk about climate change. Well, you know, if we do that, what happens if we do this and, you know, nothing changes or whatever? Well, then we have a cleaner environment. You know, I think there are enough other reasons to not choke our animal, wildlife, our fish, and all that sort of stuff in the oceans. Well, yeah, unfortunately, the deer don't seem to be getting enough plastics in them. So maybe that's a reason to just keep going. I don't know. But anyway.
Well, Dr. Brandis, thank you very much. Let's give him another round of applause. Yes, and thank you all for coming tonight, and we appreciate your attendance, and we hope to see you back after the new year.